For years, the Baltic frontier has been treated as one of Europe's most sensitive pressure points. But the latest development on Latvia's border with Belarus reveals something much larger than a single border crossing being closed. On July 31, Latvia shut down the last remaining open road crossing between itself and Belarus. Officially, the explanation was simple: a technical failure. But look at what happened in the days and months surrounding that announcement, and a very different picture begins to emerge. Because Latvia was not simply closing a gate. It was effectively sealing the final overland connection between the two countries. And that decision comes after years of what Latvian officials describe as hybrid pressure from Belarus and, ultimately, Russia. The story begins with a border that had already been slowly disappearing. One crossing after another had been closed. The Sileni crossing had been shut since 2023. Pedestrian and bicycle crossings were later restricted. Passenger rail connections had already been dramatically reduced. Other local crossings had disappeared from normal use. By July 31, only the Patoniki crossing remained. Then that gate went dark. Latvia's Interior Minister, Gints Dimbitis, said the information systems at the crossing had malfunctioned, making normal border control impossible. Latvian citizens still in Belarus were advised to return through Lithuania or Poland. No clear reopening date was announced. On paper, this was a technical problem. But the timing is what makes the story difficult to ignore. Only one day earlier, the same Latvian authorities had warned citizens against traveling to Belarus. And this time, the explanation had nothing to do with computers. The warning cited the security risks associated with what Latvia described as Belarus's ongoing hybrid warfare. Then came the border data. During the winter, illegal crossing attempts along this sector had fallen to fewer than 2 per day on average. After March 25, the pattern changed dramatically. The average rose to roughly 70 attempts per day. On some days, the number went beyond 100. And the pressure was not distributed evenly along the European Union's entire border with Belarus. On July 13, authorities recorded 42 attempted crossings across the EU-Belarus frontier. 41 of those attempts were concentrated on the Latvian section. That is an extraordinary level of concentration. Since 2021, Latvian authorities say they have prevented more than 49,000 illegal crossing attempts. So the central question is no longer simply whether Latvia's border computer system failed. The bigger question is why the pressure on this particular border has increased so sharply. And to understand that, we have to go back 5 years. The original playbook. The modern Belarus migration crisis began taking shape in 2021. Alexander Lukashenko's government was already under intense pressure from the European Union. His disputed 2020 presidential election had triggered mass protests and a brutal crackdown, with tens of thousands detained. Then, in May 2021, Belarus forced a Ryanair passenger aircraft to land in Minsk after claiming there was a bomb threat. The real objective was to arrest opposition journalist Roman Pratasevich. European sanctions intensified. And Minsk responded with a threat that would eventually become a powerful instrument. Belarus indicated that it would no longer prevent migrants and other illicit flows from reaching the European Union. Within months, the machinery was in place. Travel routes from the Middle East became easier. Belarusian airline Belavia expanded connections to cities including Istanbul, Damascus, and Dubai. Thousands of people arrived in Minsk and were then directed toward the EU's external frontier. Poland became the main flashpoint. Thousands of migrants gathered near the Polish border. European leaders quickly recognized that this was not behaving like an ordinary migration crisis. The European Commission described it as a hybrid attack. The objective was not simply to move people across a border. It was to create political pressure inside the European Union. Border guards had to respond. Governments had to spend money. Emergency measures were introduced. Fences went up. And European societies were forced into another bitter argument over migration and border security. But the strategy did not disappear when Poland strengthened its border. It moved. The pressure shifted toward Lithuania. Then toward other parts of Europe. And more recently, Latvia has found itself increasingly exposed. Why Latvia? Latvia is not an accidental target. It is one of Ukraine's strongest supporters in the Baltic region and one of the European countries most openly critical of Russian aggression. Riga has also taken increasingly tough measures against Russian influence. Russian-language public broadcasting has been restricted. Economic links with Russia and Belarus have been reduced. Security cooperation with NATO has expanded. And Latvia is approaching another parliamentary election. That combination makes the country particularly vulnerable to a hybrid strategy designed not merely to create a physical crisis, but a political one. Latvian border officials have warned that the objective could be to generate public frustration, make citizens believe the government has lost control, deepen political divisions and create opportunities for politicians sympathetic to Russian or Belarusian interests. In other words, the border itself may only be one battlefield. The real target could be public confidence. This year alone, Latvia says more than 7,600 people have already been stopped while attempting to cross the border illegally. The total for 2025 was more than 12,000. And according to Latvian officials, the smugglers involved are becoming increasingly aggressive. Border patrol vehicles have reportedly been rammed. Guards have been forced to deploy specialized equipment. Warning shots have been fired. And the Latvian border infrastructure is still not completely finished. Officials estimate that around 10% of attempted infiltrators may still succeed. That has prompted Latvia to seek additional military support. The government has also extended its reinforced security regime along the Belarusian frontier through the end of 2026. Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland have provided personnel support as well. So when Latvia closed the Pataniki crossing, it was not acting in isolation. It was the latest move in a security buildup that has been underway for years. Latvia builds a wall. Look at the sequence. In 2022, following Russia's mobilization, Latvia suspended crossings at parts of its Russian frontier. In 2023, Sileni on the Belarusian border was closed. That allowed dozens of border guards to be reassigned to the so-called green border, the forested areas where illegal crossings were more likely. In 2025, pedestrian and bicycle movement through remaining eastern crossings was restricted. Bus services to Belarus were curtailed. Restrictions were also introduced on property purchases by Russian and Belarusian citizens. Import controls followed. And along the eastern frontier, Latvia continued building a sophisticated border barrier equipped with sensors and surveillance technology. The objective was obvious. Make the eastern frontier harder to penetrate and easier to monitor. But Latvia is not building this wall alone. NATO's military presence in the country has been expanding. The Canadian-led multinational force based at Adatsi has been strengthened. Canada has also committed to expanding its military presence and bringing Leopard 2 tanks to Latvia. So while the physical border is becoming harder to cross, the military architecture behind it is becoming stronger. And that brings us to Belarus. Because while Latvia has been closing doors, Minsk has been opening them. Two opposite border policies. In 2024, Belarus introduced visa-free entry for citizens of dozens of European countries. The policy was subsequently extended through the end of 2026. European citizens can enter Belarus through international road crossings, rail checkpoints and airports. For citizens of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, the permitted stay can be even longer under the special arrangements. Minsk presents this as evidence that Belarus remains open to European visitors. The government says hundreds of thousands of people from eligible countries have already entered. But Latvia sees the same policy differently. Latvian and Lithuanian authorities have repeatedly warned their citizens about traveling to Belarus. From Riga's perspective, the issue is not whether Belarus can physically open its border. The issue is what happens to people once they enter a state controlled by Lukashenko. This creates an extraordinary contradiction. Belarus is simultaneously making it easier for Europeans to enter and making it easier, according to its critics, for migrants to reach Europe's external border. One side opens the door. The other side keeps building walls. And both policies serve Minsk's political narrative. The cost of closing the border. Economically, the consequences of Latvia's decision may appear relatively small. Trade between Belarus and the European Union has already been devastated by years of sanctions. Travel has been heavily restricted. Many of the traditional economic connections disappeared long ago. So shutting one final crossing does not suddenly destroy a thriving commercial relationship. That relationship is already largely gone. The real cost is strategic. Every closure removes another remaining channel between Belarus and the European Union. Every crossing that disappears makes Belarus more isolated from the West. And greater isolation increases Minsk's dependence on Moscow. The same dynamic can be seen on Russia's side. On July 1, Russia announced the closure of 7 railway border crossings involving Finland, Estonia, and Latvia. The decision covered passenger, vehicle, and freight traffic. No detailed justification was given. The timing was notable. Russia had recently increased railway freight tariffs affecting the Baltic states. And reports had emerged warning of potential Russian provocations against the Baltic region. But there is an important economic reality here. The Russian economy is not being devastated by these closures because so much of the previous trade has already disappeared under sanctions. The economic relationship between Russia and the Baltic states has been shrinking for years. The border closures are therefore more significant as symbols than as immediate economic weapons. The old commercial frontier is disappearing. And in its place, a security frontier is emerging. The Russian side of Latvia. Latvia's Belarusian border is only part of the story. Along the Russian border, some crossings remain open. But access is increasingly restricted. Electronic reservations are required. Vehicles face intensive inspections. Russian-registered vehicles have faced EU restrictions since 2023. Unscheduled passenger bus services have been suspended. And only limited railway connectivity remains. Behind all of this stands a border barrier stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Latvia is effectively transforming its eastern frontier from an economic gateway into a defensive line. And this is happening across the Baltic region. Because Latvia is not the only country preparing for the possibility of a confrontation with Moscow. The larger chessboard. The Baltic states have spent years describing Russian and Belarusian actions as part of a broader hybrid campaign. Airspace incidents. Suspicious balloons. Cyber operations. Migration pressure. Disinformation. Border provocations. Each incident may look small when viewed independently. Together, however, they form a pattern. And the Baltic states have increasingly responded by strengthening NATO's position across the region. That brings us to 2 geographical points that matter enormously. Kaliningrad and the Suwalki Gap. Kaliningrad is Russia's heavily militarized Baltic exclave, separated from mainland Russia. For Moscow, it is strategically important. But its geographical position is also a vulnerability. With Finland and Sweden now inside NATO, Russia's position in the Baltic Sea has become significantly more constrained. The Baltic Fleet operates in an increasingly NATO-dominated maritime environment. On land, Kaliningrad depends on access through territory surrounded by NATO members. And that brings us to the Suwalki Gap. This narrow stretch of territory between Poland and Lithuania connects the Baltic states with the rest of NATO while separating Kaliningrad from Belarus. For years, military planners have described it as one of NATO's most vulnerable geographical points. Today, however, that same corridor is being fortified. Poland is developing its eastern defenses. The Baltic states are building interconnected defensive infrastructure. NATO forces are stationed in Latvia. And allied military formations are positioned across the region. The result is a strategic paradox. Russia and Belarus have spent years testing NATO's eastern frontier. But each test has encouraged NATO to reinforce that same frontier. The pressure designed to create vulnerability has helped produce militarization. The border designed to intimidate has become the justification for a stronger defensive wall. But there is another side. There is still an important caveat. We cannot prove that the July 31st closure itself was deliberately engineered as part of a Belarusian operation. Latvia's official explanation, a technical malfunction, could be completely genuine. Border control systems fail. When they fail, crossings may have to close. Belarus has consistently rejected accusations that it deliberately created the migration crisis. Lukashenko's government has argued that migrants are not being forced toward Europe and that Belarus has even attempted to persuade some of them to leave. There is also a cost for Latvia. Latvian citizens in Belarus now face more complicated journeys home. Freight traffic is disrupted. Family and personal connections across the border become more difficult. And Baltic border enforcement policies have themselves faced criticism from international organizations and human rights groups. So the picture is not black and white. But the larger pattern is difficult to dismiss. One technical failure does not explain 5 years of escalating border pressure. One malfunction does not explain the dramatic increase from fewer than 2 daily crossing attempts to an average of roughly 70. One closed gate does not explain the systematic dismantling of almost every remaining legal crossing. The significance comes from the accumulation of events. The bigger transformation. And that may be the most important point. 5 years ago, Europe was debating how to prevent Belarus from using migration as a weapon. Today, Latvia is responding by transforming its entire eastern frontier. Fences are going up. Sensors are being installed. Military units are moving closer to the border. NATO forces are expanding. Road crossings are disappearing. Rail links are shrinking. Economic connections are being severed. And the eastern edge of the European Union is beginning to look less like an ordinary international boundary and more like a military frontier. That is the extraordinary reversal taking place in the Baltic region. After the Cold War, Europe spent decades trying to make borders less important. Today, the opposite process is underway. Europe's eastern borders are becoming more important than ever. But there is a crucial difference between the walls of the old Cold War and the walls being built today. The old barriers were primarily designed to prevent people from leaving. The new barriers are being designed to prevent hostile states from exploiting movement across borders. And that distinction matters. Because the real measure of this new European security environment may not simply be how many troops are stationed in a country. It may be how quiet its borders become. A sudden wave of migrants can be a warning. A drone crossing the frontier can be a warning. An unexplained balloon can be a warning. A cyber attack can be a warning. And when a border suddenly goes silent after years of pressure, that silence may itself be evidence that a defensive strategy is working. Or it may simply mean the next phase has not yet begun. Latvia has now closed its final overland gateway to Belarus. The gate is shut. The fence is rising. NATO is reinforcing the region. And Kaliningrad and the Suwalki Gap are becoming increasingly important pieces on the European security chessboard. The question is no longer whether the Baltic region is being tested. It is how far this confrontation will go, and whether the increasingly fortified eastern frontier of Europe will deter the next move or simply prepare the battlefield for it. What do you think? Is Latvia's decision primarily a legitimate security response, or is Europe becoming trapped in an escalating cycle of border militarization? Let me know your view in the comments. And if you want deeper geopolitical analysis beyond the daily headlines, subscribe for the next episode.